What if the most powerful man on earth, a man with absolute dominion over the known world, whose every whim was law, dedicated his life to a philosophy teaching the utter powerlessness of all external things? For this is not a thought experiment, but the story of a Roman emperor, the story of Marcus Aurelius, a man whose legacy haunts Western political thought. The seemingly impossible dream first articulated by Plato, of the philosopher king, a ruler motivated not by greed or ambition, but by a genuine love of wisdom and truth. This dream has often proven fragile, as the story of power is too often a story of corruption, violence, ego, and madness. Yet for one brief shining moment in the 2nd century AD, at the absolute zenith of the Roman Empire's power, this impossible dream became a reality. For Marcus Aurelius was not just an emperor interested in philosophy, he was a philosopher condemned by a strange and agonizing twist of fate to be the emperor. His true and enduring legacy is not found in triumphal arches or conquered territories, but in a small, intensely personal book we know today as Meditations, though he gave it no official title, for it was never intended for publication, being his private journal, his secret workbook, whose original Greek title, ta eis hodem, simply means to myself. A key to understanding that this is not a grand philosophical treatise, but a series of self-admonishments and spiritual exercises. This book is a practical handbook for the soul, written by a man struggling day after day to be a good person in the most difficult job in the world. The record of a soul at war with itself, where the central conflict was the profound and irreconcilable tension between his inner nature and his external duty, for by nature he was a quiet, serious, and introspective scholar, whose greatest joy was the discovery of philosophy and the contemplative life of the mind. But fate had a different plan, as through a series of adoptions common in the imperial system, this quiet, bookish boy was chosen from a young age to one day rule the entire known world. His destiny not to be a scholar in a library but a commander of armies, a Supreme Court judge, and the central pillar of an unimaginably vast and complex global empire, forcing him to live a constant and exhausting struggle to reconcile these two opposing worlds. He had to be a Stoic, who believed in the vanity of all worldly things while living in a palace of unimaginable luxury, a philosopher who prized tranquility while spending over a decade as a wartime commander on the frozen frontiers of the empire, and a man who believed in the universal brotherhood of humanity while commanding a political system built on conquest and slavery, his book, Meditations, being the intimate, real-time record of this struggle. To understand this man and his wisdom, we will first explore the world of the reluctant emperor, looking at his youth, the golden age of Rome he inherited, and the Stoic education that became the armor for his soul. Then we will perform a deep dive into the Philosopher's Handbook, unpacking the core themes of the Meditations itself, from the inner citadel to his vision of social duty, followed by standing with him in the heart of the storm in a phase called the Ruler in Agony. Finally, we will examine the legacy of the philosopher king, looking at his death on the frontier, the tragic aftermath of his reign, and what his quiet, solitary wisdom has to offer us in our own turbulent times. So we begin our journey into the mind of this strange and noble emperor, the master of the world, whose entire philosophy was an exercise in accepting his own powerlessness over the things that truly matter. A man whose greatest work was a series of secret notes written only to himself. This reluctant emperor did not come to power in a time of crisis, but was born into the very peak of what historian Edward Gibbon called the happiest and most prosperous period in human history. A child of the golden age of the Roman Empire. For to understand the man we must first understand the world that shaped him. The 2nd century AD, the high water mark of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, and from the Rhine to the Sahara. Within this immense territory, a single system of law, a common currency, and an incredible network of stone-paved roads connected millions of people, a world of flourishing cities and magnificent architecture for a privileged member of the ruling class. It was a world of unprecedented peace and stability. This was the world Marcus Aurelius was born into in the year 1201 AD. Born not as Marcus Aurelius but as Marcus Annius Verus, to a prominent aristocratic family. From his earliest childhood, it was clear he was not a typical Roman aristocrat, as accounts describe a boy who was unusually serious, honest, and gentle. a boy who fell in love not with military games, but with the contemplative world of philosophy. His exceptional character, noticed early on by the Emperor Hadrian, who gave him the nickname Verissimus, meaning the most true. And it was Hadrian who set in motion the chain of events that would determine Marcus's entire life. The secret to the stability of this golden age was a unique solution to imperial succession, where emperors chose their successors by adopting the most competent and virtuous man they could find, and as Emperor Hadrian lay dying, he chose Antoninus Pius as his successor, on the condition that Antoninus must in turn adopt two younger boys, one being Lucius Verus and the other being the 17-year-old Marcus, placing the quiet, bookish boy on a direct path to the imperial throne. What followed was a long and peaceful apprenticeship under his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius, whose 23-year reign is remembered as a period of almost complete tranquility, the calm eye of the storm. During these 2 decades, Marcus served with unwavering loyalty, learning the difficult business of government, while also having the time to pursue his true passion, immersing himself in the teachings of Epictetus and the rigorous disciplines of Stoicism. This is the great tragic irony of his life, that his beautiful, peaceful, and philosophical youth was the perfect preparation for a life that would be the exact opposite. For while the empire appeared to be at its glorious peak, Marcus the philosopher could see the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, the immense pressure on the empire's frontiers from the Parthian Empire in the east and Germanic tribes in the north, and he saw the spiritual emptiness beneath the empire's material wealth. He must have felt with the deep intuitive dread of a man who studies history that the long peace could not last forever, that the golden age was coming to an end, and he, the quiet scholar who wanted nothing more than a life of contemplative tranquility, was the one who would have to stand on the wall and face the coming storm. The man trained for the library was destined for the battlefield, as the golden age had saved its greatest and most terrible storms for him. This profound education, the choice to learn the art of living from a man who had been a slave, is the secret key to understanding the Meditations, for it is not a systematic philosophical treatise, but is repetitive, disorganized, and leaps from topic to topic. It is not a work of history or a memoir, as the dramatic events of his reign are almost completely absent from its pages, and it is not a book of comforting affirmations, but is often harsh, demanding, and brutally honest. The original Greek title, Tais Hoton, to myself, reveals its secret. The Meditations is a private journal, a collection of spiritual exercises and self-admonishments written by a man for that same man. We are not the intended audience but are reading someone else's mail. It is a workbook where Marcus Aurelius did the hard daily work of trying to be a Stoic, its repetitiveness not a flaw but a feature, a way to train his own mind through constant repetition of core ideas. Its disorganization is not a sign of a scattered mind, but of a mind at work, a real-time record of his thoughts, where he is grabbing whatever philosophical tool he needs in that moment, and its harsh, critical tone is not the voice of a pessimist, but of a stern teacher scolding his student, who is himself, for he is acting as his own philosopher, his own guide, his own friend, writing to himself as a reminder of his principles in the chaos of the imperial court, or the battlefield. He writes to himself as a scold, filled with a tough self-love, calling himself out for laziness or the desire to stay in a warm bed instead of doing the work of a man, and he writes to himself as a comforter, using great Stoic ideas to soothe his own anxiety, grief and frustration, reminding himself of the vastness of time and space to put his small problems in perspective. But to truly grasp the book's nature, we must understand the biographical agony of its context. The majority of the Meditations was not written in a quiet palace library, but in a cold, damp, military tent on the frozen banks of the Danube River during a brutal and endless war. Imagine him in his 50s, in poor health, surrounded by violence, death, and disease, having spent the day dealing with military logistics, battle reports, and news of a plague ravaging his empire, a man who is cold, tired, and probably in pain. It is here, in this place, that he lights a lamp and writes to himself about justice, reason, and our duty to the human community. The book is not an academic exercise, but a lifeline, the tool he used day after day to keep himself from being consumed by the violence and despair of his world, an act of a man desperately trying to hold on to his own humanity in the most inhuman of circumstances. And this leads to the great miracle of the book, its survival. This intensely private journal, which he almost certainly would have had burned upon his death, somehow survived through some historical accident we will never understand. And this book that was never meant to be a book, this journal, written by one man to save his own soul, has become one of the most beloved and universal books on spiritual and practical wisdom in history. The ultimate irony being that in the notes a man wrote to save his own soul, millions of others have found a light to guide them through theirs. What he was building, line by line in this secret journal, was a fortress, a place of absolute safety in a world of chaos, a place of profound and unshakable tranquility in the middle of a relentless storm. He called it the inner citadel, the central and most powerful metaphor in all of the meditations. That part of you that is immune to fortunes of the outside world, the sacred territory of your own mind, your ruling faculty, your hegemonic. This is the kingdom of your own reason, will and character, the one place in the universe where you are the sole and absolute sovereign. For as Marcus reminds himself, your ruling faculty is invincible. When it turns in upon itself and is content with itself, external events can assault you, your body can fail you, other people can betray you, but the citadel of your mind, if properly built and defended, can never be taken by force. The inner citadel is not a gift of nature, but an architectural project, the great work of a lifetime. For the untrained mind is not a fortress, but an open city. Vulnerable to every passing rumor and stray emotion, the citadel must be built stone by stone through constant daily practice, its foundation being the dichotomy of control, the unwavering understanding of what is and is not in your power, the bedrock upon which everything else is built. The impenetrable walls of the citadel are built from the discipline of ascent, the work of the gatekeeper who stops every impression at the gate to be examined, refusing to agree to any irrational and destructive judgment. The watchtowers are built from the practice of objective perception, learning to see the world as it is from a cosmic perspective that shrinks your petty dramas into insignificance, and the law that governs all life within the citadel is virtue. This was not an abstract project for Marcus. His outer life was a constant and unending siege. A military defeat was an army battering the gates. A political conspiracy was a traitor opening a side door. The death of a child from plague was a catapult stone of grief, crashing against the walls, and his own chronic pain was a sickness within the city itself. The Meditations is the record of him desperately shoring up his own psychological fortifications against this relentless onslaught. From this fortress he could then practice the retreat, not a physical escape, but a momentary internal act. In the middle of chaos or stress he could withdraw for an instant into the quiet, orderly, and safe space of his own mind, regrounding himself in his principles before re-engaging with the world, not from a position of reactivity, but from the calm, strong position of the commander in his citadel, the great paradoxical secret of Stoic strength. This inner citadel is a fortress built outside of time. But Marcus knew the man inside was a creature of flesh and blood, a temporary being swept along in a great current. To maintain peace within the citadel, he had to constantly meditate on the nature of the world outside its walls, confronting the profound and difficult truth of his own impermanence, which is why his journal is filled with relentless reminders of his own cosmic insignificance. The master of the world was obsessed with his own powerlessness in the face of time, because he knew the greatest disease of power is the disease of ego. Surrounded by people who treated him not as a man but as a god, it would be almost impossible not to believe in the illusion of your own supreme importance. So his constant meditation on death was not a morbid obsession but a self-administered medicine, the antidote to the poison of his own power. There is a famous story of a slave whispering, "Memento mori," or "Remember, you must die," into the ear of a victorious Roman general during his triumph. And in the Meditations, Marcus Aurelius becomes his own slave, whispering this terrible and necessary truth into his own ear. Day after day, he reminds himself of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, who conquered the world and are now dead, dust, their great empires vanished. He writes with brutal honesty that Alexander the Great and his mule driver both died, and the same thing happened to both. A practice of humility to fight the illusion that being an emperor made him special. But this practice was also a tool for cultivating urgency and purpose, for the thought of death is the ultimate filter, a clarifying fire that burns away everything trivial, leaving only what truly matters. His most famous self-admonishment is, "You could leave life right now, let that determine what you do and say and think," not a depressive thought, but the ultimate productivity hack, a call to radical, present-moment awareness. For if you knew this day could be your last, would you waste time on petty arguments or procrastinate on your most important work? The awareness of death forces you to live with an intense and beautiful focus on virtue, right now. He uses the metaphor of time as a river, a strong current where things appear only to be swept away. Our own lives just a brief flicker in this endless cosmic current. Our achievements and failures all washed away. And for Marcus, this was not a cause for despair, but for liberation. For if everything is temporary, then our worldly troubles, anxieties, and pains are also temporary, freeing us from our attachments and the fear of loss. The great, life-affirming secret at the heart of the emperor's obsession with death is that he did not meditate on his own end, to become morbid, but to become truly and urgently alive. He understood that it is only in the cold, clear light of our own mortality that the true, precious, and fleeting beauty of a single moment can be seen. To learn how to live, he teaches, you must first learn how to face the reality of your own death every single day. This meditation on the vastness of time was one tool he used to achieve perspective. But he had another equally powerful exercise, a tool for traveling through space, a technique for shattering the narrow prison of his own ego and looking at his life from the heavens, the great Stoic and Platonic exercise known as the view from above, a profound act of the philosophical imagination designed to break the spell of our own self-importance. The practice begins where you are, as Marcus would instruct himself to float up, out of the room, seeing your home, your neighborhood, then your entire city, a sprawling grid of lights, where millions of other people live lives as complex and vivid as your own, each with their own secret hopes and private fears. You keep rising until you can see the curve of the earth, your continent just a patch of green and brown on a vast blue sphere. Float further out, and see the earth itself, a tiny, beautiful, and fragile marble suspended in the silent blackness of space. A single pale blue dot in an ocean of cosmic indifference. And from this vantage point, consider the thing causing you so much stress, that argument, that mistake, that fear about your future. Where is it? From this cosmic perspective, can you even see it? The problem that felt like the center of the universe is revealed as a microscopic event. This exercise is not meant to invalidate your suffering, but to provide a radical and necessary context, the ultimate antidote to the tyranny of the ego. And imagine the biographical agony that made this exercise so essential for Marcus, an emperor who was the center of the known world, surrounded by people who treated him as a god. The danger of developing a monstrous sense of importance was a near certainty. This was his daily medicine against the disease of his own power. He had to constantly and deliberately remind himself of his own cosmic insignificance to maintain his sanity and humility. Even in his war tent on the Danube, planning the movements of legions, he would retreat in his mind to this view from above, seeing the great Roman Empire as just one small patch on a single planet, not escaping his duties but preparing himself to perform them wisely, knowing an intoxicated ego cannot make just decisions. The view from above does two things. It not only shows us our own insignificance, but also our profound connection, for when you look at the earth from space, you do not see divisions, borders, tribes, or nations. You see a single, unified human family on a shared and fragile home. This is the philosophical foundation for the Stoic virtue of justice, fostering a sense of our shared humanity and common destiny. To truly understand the immense importance of your duty on earth, you must first travel to a place where the earth itself is just a speck of dust. To find your connection to the whole of humanity, you must first experience your own profound and absolute cosmic solitude. The ultimate perspective on a human life is found not by looking closer at it, but by looking away from a vantage point so vast that everything you hold dear, including yourself, has almost completely disappeared. This profound vision of the earth from a cosmic distance does more than shrink our private anxieties. It reveals a second and equally important truth, that the world is not a collection of separate individuals, but a single interconnected living system, that we are not isolated atoms, but part of a vast and intricate community. This is the foundation of Marcus Aurelius's social philosophy, his sense of our inescapable and sacred duty to the human hive. The modern world is built on individualism, but the Stoics would have seen this as a profound misunderstanding of our nature. Marcus defines his own dual citizenship by writing, "My city and my country, so far as I am Antoninus, is Rome. But so far as I am a man, it is the world," a radical idea, arguing that our primary allegiance is to the entire human community, based on the belief in the universal logos. The Stoics believed all human beings possess a spark of the divine reason that governs the cosmos, making us all brothers and sisters, fellow citizens of one great cosmic state. Marcus brings this universal principle to a practical level, with his favorite metaphor for human society, the beehive. Writing again and again, "What is not good for the hive is not good for the bee," a profound statement about our fundamental nature as social creatures built for cooperation. A life lived only for oneself is an unnatural and mutilated life. A bee that separates itself from the hive will die, and a human who cuts themselves off from the community is cutting themselves off from their own nature. This is also a radical redefinition of self-interest, for our own true good is completely inseparable from the common good. An action that harms the community ultimately harms yourself, and a life of service is the most fulfilling life possible. This was the source of his greatest biographical agony, the crushing weight of his imperial duty as the single bee upon whom the survival of the entire hive depended. The endless stream of legal cases, the logistics of the grain supply, the reports from the frontiers, all stood in painful opposition to his personal desire for a quiet, contemplative life. The Meditations is filled with the record of this daily struggle, of a man forcing himself out of bed to do his duty. He prepares himself at the beginning of each day for the people he will have to deal with, the meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, and jealous, reminding himself that he cannot be injured by them, nor can he be angry with his kinsmen. For we are made for cooperation. This is the practical application of the philosophy. His duty to the hive requires him to be a just and patient leader, even when the individual bees are deeply annoying. His philosophy of social duty is the practical expression of the four cardinal virtues. Justice is acting for the good of the community. Temperance is mastering your own selfish desires for the sake of the hive. And courage is being willing to risk your own comfort to protect the whole. The good life, for Marcus, is the life of a good bee, to find your own specific role in the great hive of humanity, and to perform it with virtue and without complaint. He was a man who possessed absolute power, yet he saw himself not as a master, but as a humble and often tired servant. Understanding that the individual is just a single limb on the great body of humanity, a single bee in the great hive of the cosmos, the ultimate paradox of his rule is that he believed the only way to truly serve yourself is to completely forget yourself and to dedicate your entire life to the service of the common good. This profound commitment to social duty runs into a very practical problem. What do you do when the other bees are infuriating? How do you maintain your tranquility when surrounded by arrogance, dishonesty, and malice? This is the problem of anger, which the Stoics saw not as a useful emotion, but as a form of madness, a brief insanity that completely overthrows our most precious faculty, our reason. The Stoic diagnosis of anger is precise. It is the result of a series of false judgments. First, that we have been harmed. Second, that this harm was unjust. And third, that the proper response is a desire for revenge. For a practicing Stoic, every single one of these judgments is an error in reason. For nothing external can truly harm our inner citadel, our character, therefore the judgment "I have been harmed" is always an illusion. The desire for revenge is the ultimate madness, the act of willingly surrendering our own inner peace and handing control of our emotional state over to the very person who has wronged us. Marcus Aurelius as emperor was perhaps the most insulted man in the world, surrounded by schemers and flatterers. His daily life a constant barrage of potential provocations. The biographical agony of his reign was the daily grind of having to lead and love deeply flawed people. He trained every single day, giving us his personal recipe in his morning preparation, saying to himself that he will meet ungrateful, violent, treacherous, and envious men, but that all these things have come upon them through ignorance of what is good and evil. This is a profound psychological technology. First, he practices premeditatio malorum, or negative visualization, preparing for the worst, which vaccinates him against shock and surprise. Second, he immediately reframes the cause of their behavior. They are this way, not because they are evil, but because of ignorance. An act of intellectual empathy that transforms potential anger into a kind of philosophical pity. Third, he reminds himself of his connection to them, that they are his kinsmen by participation in the same intelligence and divinity, a call to a radical and difficult solidarity. And finally, he reminds himself of the dichotomy of control. He concludes that none of them can injure him, for nobody can implicate him in what is degrading. This was his morning armor, a four-part meditation to prepare his soul for the daily battle of human interaction. But his toolkit also included deconstruction, breaking an action down into its objective components, and perspective, remembering the vastness of time to see how trivial an offense is, and self-examination, considering his own similar faults before getting angry at another. His ultimate and most powerful response to anger was his philosophy of forgiveness, understanding that to respond to anger with anger is to lose the battle, to let the other person dictate the terms of engagement. The truly powerful response is the opposite. To remain calm, to be gentle, to act with a kindness that is not weakness, but a sign of unconquerable inner strength. Writing the best way of revenge is not to be like unto them. The emperor's strange and profound strategy for emotional warfare teaches that the most powerful weapon against hatred and injustice is not a sword, but a mirror. For to be angry with another is to become a prisoner of their vice, a reflection of their own ugliness. The ultimate act of revenge is to refuse to be like the one who has wronged you, to meet their madness with your reason, their chaos with your tranquility, and their hatred with a quiet, unshakable kindness. This powerful Stoic toolkit for mastering the inner world was also applied to the most immediate and difficult of all human experiences, pain and illness. To understand his philosophy on this subject, we must understand the biographical agony that made this a daily concern for him. For Marcus was not a man of robust health, but was chronically ill, suffering from severe stomach troubles, chest pains, and a lack of sleep, likely living in a state of almost constant pain. This was the man required to lead armies in brutal campaigns, to sit for hours judging legal cases, and to endure the endless stress of ruling a vast empire. His philosophy of pain was not a theoretical abstraction, but a practical necessity. The mental tools he had to develop simply to function, its foundation being the core Stoic principle that pain, like pleasure, health and sickness, is an indifferent, a radical and difficult claim. The Stoics are not denying that pain is unpleasant, but are arguing it is not a moral evil. It cannot harm your character. It cannot make you a bad person. The only true evil is the corruption of your own reason and will. They make a crucial distinction, separating the raw physical sensation of pain from the secondary psychological judgment we add on top of it. The physical sensation is an impression, a neutral event, while the real suffering comes from the story we tell ourselves. The judgment is the story. This is terrible. This is unbearable. My life is ruined. And this secondary judgment is where the true poison lies. The central Stoic technique for dealing with pain is the discipline of assent. The practice of consciously refusing to add that second catastrophic story, experiencing the raw physical sensation without assenting to the judgment that it is an evil. For as Marcus writes, remove the judgment, and you have removed the thought, I am hurt. Remove the thought, and the hurt itself is removed. He is not talking about magically making the sensation disappear, but about a psychological act of refusing to add the second layer of mental suffering. The pain in your body is a fact, but the suffering in your soul is a choice. He practices objective description, deconstructing the pain into neutral components, not an agony, but a rough sensation in a certain part of my body, stripping it of its terrifying language to reduce it to a manageable fact. Most importantly, he practices the retreat into the inner citadel, reminding himself that the pain can only afflict his body. It cannot touch his mind unless his mind allows it to. The body can be sick, weak, broken, and in unrelenting pain, but the soul, the citadel of reason and will, can remain serene and untouched. Pain is a storm battering the outer walls of the fortress, but the commander inside remains calm and in control of his own responses. The goal is not to achieve a life without pain, which is impossible, but to endure what must be endured without losing your character, abandoning your duties, or surrendering your inner tranquility. To be the master of your own soul even when you are not the master of your own body. This heroic struggle is documented in his journal, a man in constant discomfort, forcing himself to do his work, while using his mind to keep the inner world separate from the rebellion of his own flesh. In the frail and suffering body of the emperor, we find the ultimate testament to the power of the Stoic will. He teaches us that the body and the soul are two different territories governed by two different laws. The body can be sick and broken, but the mind, if well trained, can refuse to be a prisoner in its own flesh. The greatest freedom is not a life without pain, but the discovery of a part of yourself that pain cannot touch. From where does a person draw the strength for such a difficult and constant discipline? For Marcus Aurelius, the answer was not just in cold logic, but also in a profound if complex state of faith. To understand the man, we must explore his spiritual world, his relationship with the gods and the Logos. On the surface, he was a model of conventional Roman piety. As emperor and Pontifex Maximus, it was his public duty to uphold ancient traditions and perform public sacrifices. He performed these duties with sincere and conscientious respect, but his private journal reveals a personal faith that was far deeper, more abstract and more intellectually sophisticated than the traditional worship of the Roman pantheon. The true God of Marcus Aurelius was the great central principle of Stoic theology. The Logos, the universal divine reason that permeates, orders and governs the entire cosmos, the rational soul of the universe itself. For Marcus, everything in the universe is a rational and necessary part of this grand cosmic design. But this belief was not simple or easy for him, making his faith so modern and compelling, for he was acutely aware of the alternative, returning again and again in the meditations to a central question: is the universe governed by a benevolent providence, as the Stoics believed? Or is it nothing more than a random, chaotic swirling of atoms, as the Epicureans argued? He writes, "The world is either a welter of tangled atoms or a unified cosmic order." This is the great biographical agony of his spiritual life. He is not a man of simple faith, but a modern intellectual who understands the powerful materialist arguments against his own belief system. He confronts this doubt directly, wrestling with it on the page, but in the end he always makes a conscious, deliberate philosophical choice to live as if the world were governed by a benevolent providence. This is not a choice based on logical proof, but an existential choice. A willed commitment to a meaningful worldview over a meaningless one. He makes this choice because he understands its profound practical and psychological implications. A world of pure random atoms is a world of cosmic orphans in a meaningless void. A world of nihilism, but a world governed by the Logos, is a world in which we have a home and a purpose. This belief is the absolute foundation for the rest of his philosophy. It is the foundation for his sense of purpose. If the universe is a rational whole, then he is a necessary part of that whole. His capacity for reason, a spark of the universal divine reason. His life was not an accident. He was born to play a specific part in the great cosmic drama, giving his grueling work a profound cosmic significance. It is also the foundation for his great principle of amor fati, the love of one's fate, the belief that everything that happens must be a necessary and ultimately good part of the whole. He writes, "Whatever happens to you has been waiting to happen since the beginning of time, which is not a grim resignation, but a joyful and liberating surrender. A trust that even in the face of plague, war and betrayal, he is in a world that is fundamentally good and rational. And finally, it is the foundation for his profound sense of social duty. For if all human beings share in the same divine Logos, we are all literally brothers and sisters, creating a sacred obligation to work for the common good." And so we find the emperor's difficult and profoundly modern faith. A man who saw the full force of the argument for a meaningless universe, yet chose as a conscious act of his will to live as if the world were a rational and benevolent whole. His faith was not an escape from the chaos of his life, but the rational and spiritual framework that gave him the strength to endure it. The ultimate paradox being that he chose to believe in a perfect cosmic order, not because it made his life easier, but because it made it infinitely more difficult. This difficult and modern faith, this choice to believe in a rational and benevolent cosmos, was not a philosophy to be practiced in a peaceful seminar room or a quiet palace garden. For Marcus Aurelius, it was a lifeline. It was a spiritual shield that he would need for the great defining and terrible trial of his life. The long peace was over. The storm that had been gathering on the horizon had finally arrived. This was the beginning of the Marcomannic Wars. In the year 1606 AD, the northern frontiers of the Roman Empire, which had been relatively stable for decades, suddenly and violently exploded as a massive coalition of Germanic and Sarmatian tribes, led by the Marcomanni surged across the Danube River frontier, pouring into Roman territory with a ferocity that had not been seen in generations. This was not a simple border raid, but a full-scale invasion, a Völkerwanderung or migration of peoples driven by pressures from further east. They overran Roman legions, sacked towns, and for the first time in centuries, an invading barbarian army crossed the Alps and laid siege to a city in northern Italy itself, Aquileia, sending a shockwave of terror through the heart of the empire and forcing the philosopher emperor, a man who prized peace above all else, to become a full-time military commander for what would be the remainder of his life. As if this unprecedented military crisis were not enough, a second, even more terrible catastrophe was unfolding at the very same time, a horror that no army could fight and no fortress could withstand, for the legions returning from a victorious campaign in the east against the Parthian Empire brought back with them more than just the spoils of war. They brought back a plague, what historians now call the Antonine Plague, likely a virulent strain of smallpox. It swept through the densely populated cities of the empire like a wildfire, a biological apocalypse that would last for nearly 15 years and by some estimates kill up to a quarter of the entire population, a silent, invisible enemy that hollowed out the army, crippled the economy, and filled the streets of Rome itself with the dead. Marcus Aurelius now found himself trapped in a nightmare. The ruler of a world that was being simultaneously torn apart by enemies from without and consumed by a pestilence from within. The biographical agony of his life had reached its terrible climax, yet it was here in the heart of this perfect storm of war, disease and death that his Stoic training revealed its true and awesome power. He did not panic, he did not despair, and he did not hide. Instead, he faced the twin crises with a methodical and almost superhuman calm. He raised new legions. He personally went to the northern frontier to command the armies and to finance the immense cost of the war without levying ruinous new taxes on his suffering people. He held a public auction in the Forum of Rome, selling off the imperial family's own golden plates, their silk robe, their jewels, and their works of art. A symbolic act that demonstrated his profound commitment to the human hive. His response to the plague was equally guided by his philosophy. He brought in doctors from all over the empire. He passed laws regarding the burial of the dead and the quarantining of the sick, and he refused to flee the city of Rome, even at the height of the contagion. Choosing to stay and share the fate of his people, all the while he continued to perform his daily duties, judging legal cases, managing the administration, and every night, in his cold military tent on the banks of the Danube, he would light a lamp and write to himself, not about the horrors of the war or the grief of the plague, but about the importance of reason, of justice, of courage, and of our duty to one another, using his philosophy not as an escape, but as the very tool he needed to endure the unendurable. A vast and powerful confederation of Germanic tribes, led by the Marcomanni and the Quadi, surged across the Danube River, overwhelming the Roman defenses and pouring into the provinces, and for the first time in centuries, a barbarian army threatened to invade Italy itself, a crisis that was not a minor border skirmish, but an existential threat to the Roman Empire, the beginning of a brutal, grinding, and almost continuous war that would consume the majority of the rest of Marcus Aurelius's life, leading us to the central biographical agony of the emperor, the great and tragic irony of his fate. The man whose entire nature was gentle, introspective, and contemplative, who loved his books and wanted nothing more than a quiet life of philosophical study, was now compelled by his duty to become a wartime commander-in-chief. The scholar was forced to become a soldier, and the man of peace was forced to become a man of war. For the better part of the last 14 years of his reign, Marcus Aurelius was not living in his palace in Rome, but in a series of bleak, cold, and damp military camps along the frozen banks of the Danube River on the absolute edge of the civilized world. His daily reality no longer the quiet debate of philosophers, but the brutal logistics of the Roman army. It was a life that was the total and complete opposite of the one he had been trained for and so deeply desired, and it is here in this most inhuman of all environments that he wrote the great testament to his own humanity, his meditations, for the book is not just a product of his philosophy, but a product of the battlefield, a document forged in the very heart of the storm, its teachings no longer abstract principles, but the practical, desperate, and necessary tools of a man trying to keep his own soul alive in the middle of a slaughterhouse, applying the dichotomy of control to the chaos of the battlefield. He knew he could not control the weather, the movements of the enemy, or the outcome of every single engagement, but he could control his own response, his own strategic decisions, his own courage, and the virtue with which he conducted himself as a commander. His motivation for fighting was not a desire for personal glory or revenge, but his duty to the human hive. He saw this war as a grim, terrible, but necessary act of service to protect the millions of citizens who lived within the peaceful borders of the empire from the chaos and violence that was threatening to engulf them. For he was the watchman on the wall, and this was his post. He applied his discipline of objective perception to sift through the panicked exaggerations of his scouts and the self-serving reports of his generals, to see the clear, objective reality of the military situation. And he applied his principles of justice and compassion even in the midst of a brutal conflict. Most famously, at the beginning of the war, when the imperial treasury had been drained, he needed to raise money to fund the armies, but instead of levying new crushing taxes on his already suffering people, he held a great public auction in the Forum and sold off his own personal imperial treasures, the golden tableware, the silk robes of his wife, the precious jewels, and the works of art from the palace. This was a direct and powerful application of his philosophy, an act of shared sacrifice, demonstrating that he was willing to bear the same burdens as his people. But we must not romanticize this, for the war was a brutal and horrific affair that dragged on for years with immense loss of life on both sides, and for Marcus, the quiet scholar, it must have been a private and personal hell. The very act of commanding armies and sending men to their deaths, a constant and agonizing assault on his own gentle nature, the meditations being the record of his struggle to not be consumed by this world. It is the voice of a man reminding himself again and again in the darkness of his tent that there is another world, a higher reality, the inner citadel of reason and of virtue that the chaos of the war cannot touch. And so we find the great defining and agonizing irony of the philosopher king. The man who most cherished peace was destined to be a man of war. The emperor, who wrote of the vanity of worldly conflict, had to spend his life engaged in the most brutal and consequential conflict of his age. His great and timeless book on the art of inner tranquility was not written in a quiet garden, but by the light of a flickering lamp, in a military tent surrounded by the sounds of death. This brutal and relentless war on the northern frontier was not the only great crisis of Marcus Aurelius's reign, for at the very same time, a new and far more terrifying invisible enemy was sweeping through the heart of the empire. It came from the east, carried home by his own returning soldiers, a disease of terrifying virulence and speed, a great pestilence that would rage for 15 years, hollowing out the Roman world from the inside. We call it the Antonine Plague, likely a devastating outbreak of smallpox, a biological catastrophe on a scale that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. At its peak, it was killing thousands of people a day in the city of Rome alone, and over the course of its rampage, it is estimated to have killed as many as 5 million people, perhaps as much as a third of the entire population in some of the hardest-hit areas. A storm of death that touched every level of society from the lowest slave to the imperial family itself. This was the world that Marcus Aurelius had to govern, a world simultaneously assaulted by a foreign war and a domestic plague, the ultimate test of the philosopher king. For it is one thing to be a Stoic in a quiet library, and another thing entirely to be a Stoic in the middle of the apocalypse. His response to this crisis reveals the profound, practical power of his philosophy. For in an age with no understanding of germ theory, the natural response was panic and flight, and while the wealthy fled Rome for their country estates, Marcus did not. He remained at his post, staying in the city with his people, a calm and stable center in a world consumed by fear. He consulted the experts, summoning the greatest physician of the age, Galen, to study the disease and advise on public health measures, and he passed strict laws regarding the burial of the thousands of dead to maintain public order. His practical response was a masterclass in responsible and courageous leadership, but it is his philosophical response in the pages of his meditations that is the most profound. For the plague was not an abstract problem for him. but an intimate and relentless tragedy. It is almost certain that among the millions of dead were friends and trusted advisors, and we know for a fact that it struck his own family, as he lost a number of his young children during this period. He was a grieving father, trying to lead an empire that was itself in a state of collective grief, the ultimate test of his Stoic faith. How could a man who believed in a rational, benevolent, and perfectly ordered cosmos make sense of this? How could a good and rational universe produce a disease that killed millions, that took the lives of innocent children with such a random and meaningless cruelty? The plague was a direct and visceral challenge to the very foundation of his entire worldview, and in his journal we see him wrestling with this. Applying his Stoic toolkit to the most extreme possible situation, he applies the practice of memento mori. The abstract idea that you must die was now a daily, unavoidable reality. He used this not to fall into despair, but to focus his mind on his duty in the present moment, writing, "Think of yourself as dead, you have lived your life, now, take what's left and live it properly." A call to action, not a morbid thought. He applied the view from above, forcing himself to see the plague not as a unique evil, but as part of the great natural and cyclical process of creation and destruction that governs the cosmos, and above all, he retreated into his inner citadel. The only stable, rational, and tranquil ground to stand on was within his own mind. He had to hold fast to his belief that while the plague could destroy his body, the bodies of his children, and the bodies of his citizens, it could not touch his soul, it could not harm his character, it could not prevent him from acting with courage, just, and a profound sense of his duty to the human hive. His philosophy was the shield that allowed him to walk through a dying world without being consumed by its despair. He chose to meet this meaningless chaos with a willed and unwavering meaning. The great agony of his reign, the plague that hollowed out his empire and his own family, was also the final terrible crucible that perfected his philosophy. This great plague created an atmosphere of profound instability, of fear, and of political opportunity, and in the year 1750 AD, while Marcus was still bogged down in the endless wars on the Danube frontier, a false rumor spread that the emperor was dead, and in this moment of perceived weakness, his most trusted general, the man he had relied on for years to govern the entire eastern half of the empire, made his move. This was the great betrayal, the revolt of Avidius Cassius, a brilliant, successful, and widely respected Syrian general, the hero of the recent Parthian War. Cassius was, in many ways, the mirror image of Marcus. Where Marcus was a contemplative philosopher, Cassius was a man of decisive and often ruthless action. Where Marcus was a model of Stoic self-control, Cassius was a figure of ambition and a more traditional, hard-edged Roman character. And now, based on the false report of his emperor's death, Cassius declared himself emperor, and the legions of the East proclaimed their allegiance to him. This was not a minor insurrection, but the single greatest nightmare of any Roman emperor, the beginning of a catastrophic civil war. The very empire that Marcus had spent his entire life working to protect was about to be torn apart. This is the biographical agony of Marcus Aurelius at its most acute, a crisis that tested him on every possible level. First, the agony of personal betrayal from a man he had promoted, trusted, and considered a friend. Second, the agony of self-doubt. For a philosopher obsessed with making sound judgments, this must have been a torment. Had he been a poor judge of character, had his own philosophical nature made him blind to the ruthless ambition of the men around him? And finally, and most terribly, the agony of his duty, the horrifying prospect of leading his weary armies not against a foreign enemy, but against his own Roman soldiers. This was the moment when it would have been so easy for him to succumb to the passions, to give in to a righteous rage, a desire for vengeance, or a paranoid fear. But Marcus Aurelius was not most emperors, he was a Stoic, and his response to this ultimate crisis is the single greatest and most historically verified demonstration of his philosophy in action. For the historical accounts record the speech he gave to his soldiers, in which he did not deliver a furious, vengeful tirade, but spoke with a tone of profound and almost unbelievable sorrow and compassion. He lamented not that he might be killed, but that he would be forced into a conflict where he might have to cause the death of his fellow Romans. He expressed a deep sadness for Cassius himself, a man he saw not as a monster, but as a friend who had been tragically misled. And then he made the most remarkable statement, telling his soldiers that his one great hope was that Cassius would not be killed or commit suicide before the two of them could meet, not so that Marcus could have the satisfaction of executing him, but so he could confront Cassius and then, as a living example of his philosophy, forgive him. Let us pause and consider the almost superhuman strength of this response. In the face of the ultimate personal and political betrayal, his primary desire was not for revenge, but for an opportunity to practice the virtue of forgiveness. This is the discipline of assent in its most extreme form. He is refusing to assent to the judgment. I have been harmed. He is refusing to be dragged down into the passion of anger, applying the dichotomy of control. He could not control Cassius's decision, but he had absolute control over his own response, and he chose to respond not with the rage of a betrayed king, but with the sad, compassionate wisdom of a philosopher. As it happened, the civil war was averted. After only 3 months, Avidius Cassius was assassinated by his own officers, and his head was cut off and sent to Marcus, who refused to see it, and refused to meet with the assassins, whose act he saw as a murder, not an act of loyalty. In the aftermath, he continued to practice his philosophy. He not only pardoned Cassius's wife and children, but protected them, ensuring their family's wealth and status were not confiscated. And most remarkably, he commanded that all of the correspondence of Cassius and his co-conspirators be brought to him. And he burned it all, unread. He did this to prevent the inevitable cycle of purges, accusations, and paranoia that always followed such an event. He chose to break the chain of revenge and to heal the wound to the state, rather than to salt it with further bloodshed. And so we are left with the emperor's most profound and difficult lesson on the nature of power. He understood that the greatest victory over an enemy is not to destroy him, but to refuse to become like him. The final and most absolute expression of his imperial authority was not the power to condemn, but the power to forgive, proving that the only way to truly be the master of the world is to first be the absolute master of your own soul. This profound act of forgiveness represents Marcus Aurelius at his absolute best. But his life was not a simple story of Stoic perfection. He was a human being destined to face one final, terrible, and deeply personal trial that would not come from a foreign enemy or a political rival, but from within his own house, a trial that would cast a long, dark shadow over his entire legacy. This was the great tragedy of his life. The problem of his son, Commodus, for the secret to the Roman Golden Age and the 5 good emperors, was the system of adoption, choosing successors based on competence and virtue. Marcus was the first of these 5 emperors in almost 100 years to have a legitimate biological son who survived to adulthood, and he would make a fateful and historically disastrous decision. He chose to break with the tradition of adoption and name his own son Commodus as his successor. And in this single paternal choice, he would unwittingly sign the death warrant for the Roman peace, for Commodus was the absolute and total negation of his father. Where Marcus was a quiet scholar, Commodus was a preening narcissist obsessed with his own physical beauty and prowess. Where Marcus was a man of duty, Commodus was a creature of pure, unrestrained appetite. Most famously, while his father was the commander-in-chief, Commodus's only true passion was for the bloody spectacle of the gladiatorial arena. He loved to dress up as Hercules and fight in the Colosseum, not against worthy opponents, but against terrified prisoners and crippled animals, a pathetic and staged performance that horrified the Roman aristocracy. He was spoiled, cruel, lazy, and deeply unserious. Everything a Stoic philosopher and a Roman emperor was not supposed to be, and the great agonizing question is, did he not see this? Was he blind to the true nature of his own son? The historical evidence suggests the opposite. He saw it with a terrifying clarity, and the meditations are filled with anxious passages about the difficulty of shaping another's character and fears about the kind of men his children might become. So why would this man, dedicated to reason, duty, and the common good, choose to hand over the world to a son he knew was unworthy? This is the great biographical agony of his final years. A conflict between 2 of the most sacred duties of his philosophy, his duty as an emperor to the human hive, and his duty as a father, to pass over his own legitimate and already popular with the army son in favor of another man, would have almost certainly triggered an immediate and catastrophic civil war the moment he died. He was trapped in a true, tragic, and insoluble dilemma. He could either be a good father and risk being a bad emperor, or he could be a good emperor and be a cruel and unnatural father, while also plunging the empire into chaos. In the end, he made the choice that was perhaps the most human. He chose to have faith in his own son, spending his final years in a desperate, last-ditch effort to educate the teenage Commodus. The historians tell us that as Marcus lay on his deathbed, he gathered his oldest and most trusted advisors, and begged them with his dying breaths to continue to be a father to his son, to guide him, to counsel him, and to try and save him from his own worst instincts. He knew the terrible danger his own son posed to the world he had given his life to protect. He saw the coming storm, and he knew that its name was Commodus, the final, heartbreaking and most human failure of the great philosopher king, a man who had conquered his own passions, forgiven his enemies, and held a collapsing world together, was powerless before the one great, irrational force his philosophy could not tame, the love of a father for his son. This great and tragic problem is made even more poignant when compared to the relationship that defined the beginning of his reign, for before he had to confront the agony of a biological heir, he first had to navigate the complexities of an adopted one, a man who was his absolute and total opposite, his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, who was raised alongside Marcus in the imperial court, and when Antoninus Pius died in the years. The first and most defining act of Marcus Aurelius as the new sole emperor of Rome was an act of profound and unprecedented loyalty. He refused to accept imperial power unless Lucius Verus was immediately elevated to be his co-emperor. This had never happened before in the history of the Roman Empire, an act of incredible generosity and a complete rejection of personal ambition. And in doing so he bound himself to a man who would serve for the next decade as his perfect foil, for Marcus was quiet, serious, and almost ascetic in his discipline, while the historical sources describe Lucius as a man who was tall, handsome, and possessed of a great and easy charm, a lover of luxury, pleasure, the games and decadent banquets, the embodiment of the tradition of pleasure-seeking Roman aristocrat that Marcus was training himself every single day not to be. This unlikely partnership was immediately tested by a crisis in the East when the Parthian Empire invaded. Lucius, who was younger and stronger, went to the front to command the legions, while Marcus remained in Rome to govern the state. But Lucius's conduct of the war was a perfect reflection of his character, while his brilliant generals were winning the battles. Lucius himself established his headquarters in the luxurious city of Antioch, where he gave himself over to a life of pleasure. While back in Rome, Marcus was performing the hard, tedious, and unglamorous work of an emperor. It was the perfect division of labor. The playboy emperor took the glory, while the philosopher emperor did the actual work. This was the great biographical agony of the first part of his reign, the constant, quiet, and deeply frustrating burden of his brother's character. Yet in the first book of the Meditations, he gives thanks for his brother, for teaching him to love his kin, truth, and justice, and most tellingly gives thanks that his brother's character could act as a spur to his own self-improvement, a masterpiece of Stoic reframing. He does not complain about his brother's laziness, but chooses to see the relationship as a tool for his own moral growth, a challenge to his own patience, duty and virtue, using his flawed brother as a whetstone to sharpen his own soul. The partnership ended in the year 1609, when Lucius Verus suddenly fell ill and died, possibly from the Antonine plague, leaving Marcus as the sole ruler of the Roman Empire, alone to face the darkest and most difficult years. And so we are left with the strange and quiet story of this imperial partnership, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher of duty, bound by fate to a brother who was a master of indulgence. And in this perfect opposition, we find a profound political and psychological lesson, for his first and greatest act as emperor was not to seize power, but to willingly give half of it away. And in learning to manage, tolerate, and even love this flawed brother, he became a wiser ruler himself. Any honest appraisal must also confront his failures, his blind spots, and the most difficult and uncomfortable questions about his legacy, for we must now step away from the admiring portrait and take on the role of the critics, and the darkest of the shadows on his reputation is the difficult and unavoidable fact of the persecution of Christians, the central, agonizing contradiction of his rule. How could this philosopher of the universal human hive have presided over an empire in which a new and growing religion was being brutally and lethally suppressed, for several notable and horrific persecutions of Christians did occur during his reign? The most famous was in the city of Lugdunum in Roman Gaul in 1770 AD, where the local governor, responding to a wave of popular anti-Christian hysteria, arrested a large group of men and women who were subjected to horrific and systematic public torture in the arena, and then finally executed. Marcus's personal role in this is the great historical question. The argument for his culpability is strong. He was the emperor with absolute power, and the ultimate responsibility rested with him, and his own private writings reveal a distinct lack of sympathy, and even a kind of aristocratic contempt for the Christian martyrs. In one of the only direct references to them, he speaks of the need to face death with a calm and reasoned dignity, not with what he calls a sheer spirit of contradiction. Like the Christians, he seems to have seen their willingness to die not as an act of noble faith, but as a kind of stubborn, theatrical, and irrational obstinacy. But there is also a case for his defense, built on historical context. Persecutions at this time were almost always local affairs, driven by mob violence and the decisions of provincial governors, trying to maintain public order, not from a direct edict from the emperor. We must try to see the Christians through the eyes of a second-century Roman ruler, to whom they were a deeply strange and unsettling group, seen as atheists because they refused to worship the traditional gods of the Roman state, an act of profound civic impiety that endangered the entire community, as the Romans believed the peace and prosperity of the empire depended on maintaining the favor of the gods. The Christians were also seen as antisocial, secretive, speaking of a king other than Caesar, and accused of all sorts of lurid and terrible practices, a strange foreign superstition that threatened the very moral and religious fabric of the Roman world. The biographical agony for Marcus is this terrible and ironic conflict, a man dedicated to a philosophy of reason, duty, and the common good. Confronted with a new religious movement that from his perspective seemed irrational, a rejection of civic duty and a threat to the stability of the human hive he was sworn to protect, his great failure was perhaps a failure of the philosophical imagination. He was unable to see the spark of the Logos in the strange and stubborn faith of this new sect. Beyond this great moral question, other more pragmatic criticisms have been leveled against his reign. While he was a dutiful commander, some historians have questioned his effectiveness as a military leader. The Marcomannic Wars were a brutal, grinding, and incredibly expensive affair that, while successful in holding the frontier, did not achieve a decisive final victory and left the empire exhausted. This financial strain was immense, and the endless wars forced him to repeatedly devalue the Roman currency, contributing to long-term economic instability. And finally, there is the critique of his philosophy itself, which some see as a kind of melancholy and world-weariness, a philosophy of endurance, not of joy, a system for a man with his back against the wall. And so the perfect, marble image of the philosopher king reveals its cracks. He was a flawed man, a man of his time, burdened by the superstitions and prejudices of his own age, even as he was trying to live by a timeless and universal philosophy. His failures do not erase his virtues, but make him a more complex, a more tragic, and a more profoundly human figure. The final, tragic irony of Marcus Aurelius is that he was a man who, in his heroic attempt to be a good man and a good Roman, may have failed to see that a new and world-changing idea of what it meant to be good was being born in the very fires of the persecutions he allowed. This complex and tragic portrait brings us now to the final act of his long and difficult life. After years of relentless war, devastating plague, political turmoil, and profound personal grief, the emperor's famously frail body finally began to fail him. We now journey with him to his final days, not in the marble halls of Rome, but in a wind-swept military camp on the cold and distant banks of the Danube River. The story of the death on the frontier. In the year 80 AD, Marcus Aurelius is 58 years old, having spent the better part of the last 14 years living the hard life of a soldier. He has finally brought the long and draining Marcomannic Wars to the brink of a decisive Roman victory. But the man himself is exhausted, weary from the unending burden of his imperial duty, and sick, likely having finally contracted the Antonine plague. He knew he was dying, and the historical accounts from Cassius Dio give us a powerful and intimate portrait of how this great Stoic philosopher chose to face his own end. His final days consumed, not by fear for his own soul, but by the last and most agonizing of his duties, his profound anxiety about the future of the empire and the character of the son he was about to leave in charge. This is the final and most intimate biographical agony of his life. Knowing his time was short, he summoned his closest friends and most trusted advisers to his bedside, and presented to them his 19-year-old son, who was with him in the camp, and who was now to become the sole master of the Roman world. He did not present his son with a father's blind pride, but with a philosopher's clear-eyed dread, begging his friends not to abandon the boy, imploring them to continue to be his teachers, his guide, his surrogate fathers, to guard him against the temptations of absolute power. Having performed this final, desperate act of public duty, he then turned his mind to the private business of dying. His response a perfect and almost textbook application of the philosophy he had practiced his entire life. He showed no fear, no self-pity, and did not rage against his fate, accepting it as a natural and necessary part of the great cosmic order of the Logos. To hasten the end and maintain his clarity of mind, he began to refuse all food and drink, and when his friends began to weep for him, he gently rebuked them. His supposed last words, a final lesson in Stoic perspective. "Weep not for me, but think rather of the pestilence, and the deaths of so many others." There is another, perhaps more intimate story of his very last word. As he lay dying, the officer of the watch came to his bedside to ask for the password for the night. And Marcus, with his final breath, is said to have given a single, perfect, and untranslatable Latin word, equanimita. It means equanimity, a state of inner stillness, of mental composure, of a soul that is in balance with itself regardless of the storms that rage outside, the goal of his entire life's work, and the final word on his lips. He died on March 7 in the Roman military encampment of Vindobona, the place we now know as the city of Vienna. He did not die in his palace, surrounded by luxury, nor in his library surrounded by his beloved books. He died as he had lived for the final, most difficult phase of his life, as a soldier at his post, performing his duty to the very end, an end that was perfectly and tragically consistent with his entire philosophy. He was a man who had spent his entire life meditating on his own mortality, and when the moment finally came, he met it not with fear, but as an old and expected friend. His final and most profound meditation was not a written word, but a lived act. The quiet, dignified, and dutiful death of a man who was more concerned with the fate of the world than with his own soul. This quiet, dignified death on the frontier was the end of a man, but it was also the end of an age, for the desperate warnings that Marcus had whispered on his deathbed were all in vain. The moment the philosopher was gone, the monster he had feared was unleashed upon the world. This is the story of the aftermath, the disastrous reign of his son Commodus and the end of the Roman Golden Age. For the very first act of the new 19-year-old emperor was a complete and total betrayal of his father's life's work, abandoning the war on the Danube frontier against the furious advice of his father's generals. He hastily signed a peace treaty that gave up many of the hard-won gains and rushed back to Rome to celebrate a triumph for a victory he had not won, his reign defined by a complete abdication of duty in favor of a relentless pursuit of personal pleasure, for Commodus was the anti-Marcus. A living, breathing, and catastrophic inversion of every single Stoic principle his father had lived by. A creature of pure, unrestrained, and narcissistic self-interest, who saw the entire Roman Empire not as a sacred trust, but as a personal playground to be plundered to fund his own decadent lifestyle. Where Marcus was a man of reason and self-control, Commodus was a man of pure, violent, and childish impulse, notoriously lazy and leaving the business of governing to corrupt favorites. And most famously, where Marcus had embodied the dignified statesman, Commodus became obsessed with the most shameful of pursuits. He wanted to be a gladiator, entering the Colosseum, dressed as Hercules to fight in pathetic and carefully staged performances against terrified prisoners or tethered animals, a vulgar and humiliating spectacle that horrified the Roman aristocracy, a profound and unforgivable violation of their entire sense of Roman dignity and order. The biographical agony that haunts this story is the great unanswerable question that must have tormented Marcus in his final years. How could he, a man who had so perfectly mastered himself, have been so utterly and catastrophically incapable of shaping the character of his own son? How could the great philosopher of virtue have raised a moral monster? This is the tragic and deeply human limit of his philosophy. You can build your own inner citadel, but you cannot build one for another person, not even for the son you love. You can command the legions of Rome, but you cannot command the soul of your own child. The reign of Commodus was a disaster. His neglect of the state, His paranoia and his purges created an atmosphere of fear and instability. And in the year 1920 he was assassinated, strangled in his bath, by a wrestler named Narcissus, as part of a palace conspiracy, and his death immediately plunged the Roman Empire into the very thing Marcus had feared most, a catastrophic civil war. The year 1930 is known as the Year of the Five Emperors, a chaotic and bloody period. The long peace, the Pax Romana, was over. The great historian, Edward Gibbon, famously chose this moment as the precise turning point when the Roman Empire began its descent into a long and tragic twilight. The century that followed would be one of almost constant crisis, of civil war, of barbarian invasions, of economic collapse, a seemingly endless succession of short-lived barracks emperors who were raised up and then murdered by their own troops. The stable, rational, and philosophical world of the five good emperors was gone forever. And so we are left with the final, heartbreaking, and most human tragedy of the great philosopher king. The Golden Age did not end with a great military defeat, but in a pathetic, almost comical, act of self-destruction. The long and wise tradition of adoptive fathers, broken by one foolish and biological son. If we judge Marcus Aurelius purely as a statesman, his legacy is a tragic and a mixed one. He was a man of immense personal integrity, of profound dedication, and of almost superhuman endurance, who held the civilized world together through the sheer force of his own character and unwavering sense of duty. But he could not secure the future. His great failure to provide a worthy successor was a catastrophic one. The peace that he had fought so long and so hard to defend died with him. And if this were his only legacy, he would be remembered as a great and tragic figure, the last good man who stood at the end of a golden age. But it is not his only legacy. Because his true and far more lasting kingdom was not the Roman Empire, it was his book. The great miracle of Marcus Aurelius is the accidental survival of his private journal, the secret notes he wrote only to himself, a book which he never intended for us to see, and which has become his most profound and most intimate gift to the future. Its enduring power lies not in the fact that it is a portrait of a perfect Stoic saint, but in the fact that it is a perfect and brutally honest portrait of a struggling human being, a record of his weakness, a testament to his own daily grinding war against his own worst instincts. This is why, 2,000 years later, we still read it, why it still has the power to console and guide us, for we are not emperors, but when we read his private thoughts, we see our own struggles reflected in the mirror of his prose. We know his frustration with difficult people, his anxiety about a future we cannot control, his grief in the face of loss, the daily temptation to choose comfort over duty, the struggle with our own anger, our own pain, and our own sense of inadequacy. The book is a source of profound comfort not because it offers a perfect model to aspire to, but because it shows us that the most powerful man in the world had to wrestle with the very same demons that we do. It is a work of radical and timeless human solidarity, and in the end, a practical handbook, the record of the tools that one man, in the most difficult of all possible circumstances, used to try and be a little better, a little wiser, and a little more human each day. The inner citadel, the view from above, the dichotomy of control, the constant meditation on his own mortality, his profound sense of duty to the human hive, these were not just theories for him, but the weapons he used in his daily internal war, and because he proved their worth in the most extreme conditions, they remain as sharp and effective for us today as they were for him in his military tent. And so we are left with the ultimate paradox of the philosopher king, his great worldly project. The continuation of the Roman Golden Age ended in tragic failure with the succession of his own son. The peace he fought so hard to defend did not last. But his other, more secret project, his private, humble, and lifelong struggle to be a good man in an impossibly difficult job, has achieved a kind of immortality. He is a testament to the most profound of all Stoic truths, that the only victory that truly matters is the victory over oneself. The Meditations is the ultimate emperor's mirror. And its final, haunting, and beautiful lesson is that when we look into it, we do not just see the face of a long-dead Roman emperor, we see ourselves.